Okay, folks, welcome to another session of PHI 215, Coronavirus Social Isolation Edition. We're going to be looking at our second lesson on theories of mind. So today we're going to think through the identity theory of mind. And also look at some criticisms of it. And like last time, there will be some quizzes on the Moodle website that you'll be able to do at your leisure in the next couple of days. So let's not waste any time. Let's get right down to it. Let's learn about the identity theory of mind. So just to review from last time, couple of things. We looked at a couple of arguments for substance dualism. So these were both arguments advanced by Descartes, right? Descartes told us that we can conceive the mind existing without there being any body. Remember, he said that we're sure that the mind exists, but we don't know yet whether material things or the material body is just an illusion. So he says, material bodies are not part of the essence of the mind. He then gives us the divisibility argument, which says it is the case that you can divide any material thing in half, but for minds or thoughts, those are things that aren't spatiotemporal, right? You can't divide a thought in half even once. Moreover, we encountered one challenge for substance dualism, and that challenge was basically a question, right? I'm actually going to get a question mark in the mix there. So the question is, how can we explain the interaction between our minds and material bodies, right? So on the one hand, if I, slap my hand, it's going to, give rise to a feeling. If I stub my toe, it's going to give rise to an even worse feeling, right? But we also see this kind of interaction going the other way. So I decide to raise my arm, right? Say I'm going to raise my arm in 3, 2, 1, and there it goes, right? So the thought there is we have interaction between material things and immaterial things. Now, the most sort of worrisome version of this challenge, we saw John Searle's version of this challenge. It basically said, look, if we understand how the laws of physics work, every effect has a physical cause, and the amount of energy and matter that there is in the universe is always constant. So if you believe in mental causation or causation by material things of immaterial events, basically you have to believe that the laws of physics are being violated every time there's a mind-body interaction when they're separate things. We also get this view, which might seem strange to you, but if we want to keep mind and body completely separate, but also respect the causal closure of the physical. That's just the view that all physical effects have physical causes, and no more and no less of them at any particular moment. You might think that mental events are just kind of like steam that rise off of physical events. And, the steam metaphor doesn't quite work because steam can actually cause things, right? The idea is it's kind of like a smoke or a vapor that just sort of emerges but doesn't actually do anything or explain anything. It's just sort of a strange byproduct of the physical world. When we notice that decisions to raise an arm can cause arms to go up, that looks like an implausible way for the substance dualist to go, to say that, mental events actually can't cause anything. So, where does that get us? It might lead you towards materialism. And one version of materialism is what we're going to call identity theory, as defended by GTCC Smart. That said, we're also going to look at some criticisms today. So we're going to look at David Chalmers' zombie argument. And then we're also going to look at Thomas Nagel's version of the knowledge argument. So let's see where we can go with this. So remember, identity theory is a popular version of materialism. So materialism, it's just a view in metaphysics. Metaphysics is a theory about what's real, what reality consists in. So the materialist says everything we know in reality, everything that's real, is material, right? What is a watch but a special arrangement of material parts for a certain purpose, right? What is a table but atoms arranged in the shape of a table? And, the materialist is going to try to explain the existence of every single thing in terms of matter in motion, right? So that's what materialism is. So identity theory is a specific version. It's going to say that the mind is identical to states of the brain. So when we say identical, we mean that two things are one and the same thing. So an example I gave you last time around, it was the example that said the 45th president of the United States, or the current president of the United States, is identical to Donald Trump, right? So the thought here is that these things are one and the same thing. They are identical. Another example that you see in the little snippet of SMART in your reading today is the thought that the lowest prime number above 5 is identical to 7, right? So the thought there is when we talk about identity, we're talking about two names for the very same thing, right? So we're going to say that the mind is identical, it's another name for a state of the brain. So here's another way of looking at it. So when we can think about this identity, we can say that lightning is identical to electrical discharge from clouds. And by analogy, we have the same kind of identity. Pain is identical to certain neural states, right? A certain electrical discharge just is what lightning is. And then Smart says a certain state of neurons is identical to pain. Here's another analogy. He says a sensation is nothing over and above a brain process. So having a sensation is just having certain things going on inside of that noggin, right? And Smart says nations, in a similar way, are nothing over and above the people that comprise them. So if you want to know what America is, you just have to know all of the people that make it up. Now, you might think that even that analogy doesn't quite work. Maybe you think that America is something more than the people who currently make it up. What about the people who used to make it up? Well, maybe we could say the same thing about the brain, right? There are atoms that used to make up the brain that you don't have anymore. They got replaced with other ones. But we might also wonder if things like a constitution or something like that might comprise a nation. Then we might start wondering, well, maybe there's something different than simply a brain state that's a little different than just certain processes going on in the brain. So there are challenges here, but I think we can see the force of GTCC Smart's idea, right? He says that if you want to know what a thought is, just try to understand what's going on in the brain, right? You've never ever observed a thought that happened outside of a material brain, have you? So we might as well think that once we understand the brain, that's all there is. And Smart points out, just because mental states happen to be brain states, it doesn't mean that the meaning or logic of brain states can be translated to the meaning or logic of mental states. So, just for instance, you might think about how a thought can be unclear, right? It doesn't mean you can say that my thoughts are unclear, so my brain states are unclear. Smart does say, even though one thing happens to be what another thing is, that doesn't mean you can just swap in the one term for the other term. So you can have unclear thoughts, although you don't have unclear brain states, or your brain states, involve certain electrochemical reactions. So your thoughts, they involve them, but maybe they don't contain them in the same way. So, this sort of point, that the meaning or logic of brain states, the way we talk about brain states, isn't exactly the way we talk about thoughts, is going to add some subtlety to Smart's view. You might try to see if you can take this point, that the way we talk about thought and the way we talk about brain states might be different, even though they are in fact the same thing. And we'll just point out, remember, we were talking about this question of how the mind and the body interact and how you get strange views like epiphenomenalism if you're a dualist. Well, if you're an identity theorist, it's not all that complicated. We can understand physical reactions working in a pretty straightforward way sometimes, right? You can understand one physical object having an effect on another physical object, right? So if one billiard ball moves and knocks into the other billiard ball and makes it move, we can understand that transfer of motion from one physical object to another physical object. And we can think about that in more complicated ways too, right? You can think about how a DVD is a physical object, and through a very complicated series of events that can get a picture of something, a picture of, let's say, a dog, onto your screen and to your eyes. And in fact, it was originally a dog that was shot by the camera, which then got onto some film, which was then taken to an editing room and put into the movie and then burned onto a DVD, which was then put into a truck and taken to your house and then put in your DVD player, right? The thought here is that all we have to explain here, it's all a series of physical events, right? So Smart is going to say, well, mind-body interaction is a lot like that, right? Mind-body interaction is basically just a very complicated series of physical interactions, kind of like the dog being seen by the camera, being put onto the DVD, being read by the DVD player, being shown on your TV, and then making it to your eyes, right? So if everything is physical, we don't have as much explaining to do as the substance dualist does. So here's a criticism of identity theory. Remember, identity theory just says that everything is physical, right? There are no non-physical objects or entities in the universe. And insofar as minds and thoughts exist, they have to be physical things too. Well, one way to criticize this is just to insist on some way of showing that we need something non-physical when we start thinking about thought. So this actually reiterates a bit of what we saw last time. So remember, Descartes' argument from last time basically said, I can imagine my mind without my body, right? I'm certain that my mind exists, but at this point we haven't ruled out that the physical material world is just an illusion created by an evil demon. And what Descartes thinks that means is that being a material thing is not part of the mind's essence, right? It's separable from it. So you can conceive of these things as being separate from each other, and that's like the central move in these arguments. Well, there is a 20th century version of this argument. I guess we could say it's a 21st century version of this argument as well, because David Chalmers is still around, and he's still defending this argument, and there are a lot of people who are persuaded by it. So, what does this guy, David Chalmers, have to say in terms of conceivability arguments? Well, in order to get going with this argument, Chalmers is going to introduce a specific concept, and it's of philosophical zombies, right? So, philosophical zombies, I'm afraid, are not as scary or interesting or entertaining as, say, what you see in a George Romero Night of the Living Dead movie or in a show like Walking Dead, right? For Chalmers, here's what he means when he talks about a zombie. He says it's a physical duplicate of a person, right? So imagine somebody sitting beside yourself, and that person sitting beside yourself had completely identical physical properties, right? So this person has, hands that are exactly the same size, right down to all the cells, right? So blood flows through the cells in exactly the same way, right? But Chalmers says that when it comes to zombies, they're exactly like you or me, but a zombie is completely lacking in conscious experience, right? So whereas when you, lift a glass of water to drink from it, or when you make a correct lane change when you're out driving, zombies do all those things exactly the same, except the way that it works for them is they're basically, you might imagine, like a very complicated machine or a robot, right? That it's all just a bunch of stimulus response reactions. But there's nothing going on in there. You might think for a zombie, it's basically like completely dark in there. There's nothing it's like to be a zombie, right? So you could imagine somebody who's exactly like you, except where when you, put a spoonful of sugar in your mouth, you're going to taste sweetness. The zombie will, swallow the sugar in the same way, but there will be no experience whatsoever, right? It's completely dark. There's no feelings, no sounds. There's just nothing it's like to be a zombie. So it's a person who acts the same way, looks the same way, is a perfect physical duplicate, but has no experience. There's nothing it's like to be a zombie. So just keep this concept of a zombie in mind. It's a physical duplicate of a person, but who lacks any conscious experience. So Chalmers says, premise one, it is conceivable that there be zombies. So what is he saying there? He's basically saying, you can imagine this to be the case, right? And here's his second point. If it is conceivable that there be zombies, it is metaphysically possible that there be zombies. Now, remember, we've already talked about conceivability as an important guide to thinking about what can be possible or not. So remember, Berkeley said it's impossible to conceive of a thing unthought of. As soon as you do it, you've thought of it, and it's no longer a thing unthought of. So it's inconceivable, right? There were problems with that argument, but we can think of other things that are obviously inconceivable in such a way that they're so inconceivable that they are not metaphysically possible. So here's one that we talked about. We talked about a perfectly round square. Well, the more you think about the possibility of a perfectly round square, we realize that it's so inherently contradictory that it's metaphysically impossible, right? But insofar as you can really clearly think about something, you can really conceive it in your mind's eye. You can conceive a perfect circle, right? Just a figure with no corners and with all of its edges perfectly equidistant to the center. You could conceive of there being a perfect circle. So it's metaphysically possible. The more you think about that you can conceive of it, the more you realize that it could be the case. So, metaphysically possible just means it's something that could be real, right? So from premise 1 and premise 2, we conceive of zombies, and then premise 2 says we can go from conceivability to metaphysical possibility. So we have metaphysical possibility. Now we say, if it's metaphysical that there be zombies, right? So if it's possible for you to be a perfect physical duplicate of your zombie, but you have consciousness and your zombie doesn't, then consciousness is not a physical thing. There's something about consciousness that is not reducible to the physical nature of something. Just like how, being a figure with no corners and with edges, all of them, or every part of an edge, being perfectly equidistant from its center, if it be metaphysically possible for that thing to exist without there being a circle, then that is not the definition of circles, right? Circles would not be that. But, so if we can get a separation there, right? If it's metaphysically possible that there are zombies, then consciousness couldn't just be a physical fact, right? If consciousness were a physical fact, that would be a guarantee that zombies weren't metaphysically possible. So because they are, consciousness can't be physical. So consciousness is non-physical. So this argument follows validly, right? If you accept premise 1, premise 2, and premise 3, consciousness is not physical. And, a suppressed premise in the book, if consciousness is not physical, then the mind could not be identical to the brain states. We'd need something other than a material state of the world to explain or to make up this thing that is consciousness. So that's Chalmers's argument against identity theory. It's also a conceivability argument, like Descartes', right? Because really, what both of these arguments are doing is saying that we can imagine the mind coming apart from the body, right? And insofar as we can imagine them coming apart, we realize that they can't be the same thing, as Smart tried to tell us. So, what should we do here if you're a materialist? So one possible criticism, and this is the one that Vaughan gives you in the book, it's that you should deny premise 1. So you should deny that it's actually conceivable that there be zombies. So could you really believe that you could duplicate every single part of your body? Not just your toes and your fingers, but your brain and your spinal cord. And that once you duplicate your brain, wouldn't you just be making more consciousness? That would be like trying to imagine a duplicate of your working DVD player that's, currently playing your favorite movie. My favorite movie is Fargo. So we can imagine a TV and a DVD player playing Fargo, and then we make a perfect physical duplicate. Well, could I imagine a perfect physical duplicate of that TV, but which wasn't playing Fargo at the same time? Well, actually, when you think about it that way, I guess you can't, right? So that would say you actually can't imagine a perfect physical duplicate that is exactly the same physically, but not having experiences. Here's another possible criticism. This one's not in your book, but y'all are smart, and I think that this is an important criticism that you should think about. So I can even add this. So this is going to be a suggestion that premise 2 right? So the thought here is that there's a mistake in Chalmers' argument when he says this thing right here. So in premise 2, he tells us that if you can conceive of it, then it's metaphysically possible. So remember, saying that something is metaphysically possible is saying that it could be real. So does it mean that everything you imagine could be real? Well, some people might say no. Maybe you can imagine time travel, but that doesn't mean that time travel is a real possibility. We imagine movies where time travel happens all the time. Doesn't mean it's metaphysically possible. Another kind of thing you can imagine is we can imagine when we watch movies that people can have body swaps, right? So one example would be something like Freaky Friday, right? So in the newest version, Jamie Lee Curtis and Lindsay Lohan have their minds swapped out of their own bodies and into the other one's body. So, Lindsay Lohan is now living in her mom's body, and her mom is now living in Lindsay Lohan's body, that kind of thing. Doesn't mean that, body swaps are actually metaphysically possible in the real world. One more example. I can tell you, I can imagine the possibility of a solid piece of iron floating on top of liquid water, right? So we've just got a piece of iron floating on top of liquid water. I'm saying I'm imagining it, right? I can imagine it all day long, that we've got iron floating on water. But it seems that just because you can imagine iron floating on water doesn't mean, unless you give me some sort of silly example where you've put saran wrap over top of the water or something, and that's not really floating, right? So just because you can imagine something, just because something is conceivable, doesn't mean it's metaphysically possible. So that might be another way of arguing against Chalmers' argument against the identity theory, famously known as, no surprise here, the zombie argument, right? Zombies are conceivable. If zombies are conceivable, then they're possible. If they're possible, then consciousness can't be physical. So here's another kind of argument. This other kind of argument is called a knowledge argument. So this criticism says this. If identity theory were true, if the mind was just the brain, then there would be certain kinds of knowledge that we could acquire. But these certain kinds of knowledge that the identity theory would imply we can acquire are actually unattainable, so identity theory is false. So note that when we're stating the argument this way, it's a modus tollens argument, right? It says, if P, if identity theory, then Q. Then we could know certain kinds of stuff. But we can't know that certain kind of stuff, so identity theory can't be true. If P, then Q, not Q, therefore not P. You see that? If identity theory were true, we could know a whole bunch of stuff, but these are things that we actually can't know, so identity theory can't be true. Just to go over that one more time. So the idea here is this. It's that we can gain knowledge about brain states through empirical investigation, right? We can hook up the fanciest MRI machines or the fanciest new technology and microscopes for understanding how neurons work. Do as much chemistry as we like. But there are certain things about mental states and thought that are utterly different from the kinds of facts that a scientist could observe in a laboratory. So let's have a look at a very famous argument by this guy right here. This guy is Thomas Nagel. So Nagel wrote a famous paper called "What is it like to be a bat?" And here's what Nagel says. He says, through scientific study, we could come to know all the physical facts about the bats. About bats, right? Not just like the bats that are currently here in the world now, but like the nature of bats, right? So you could learn exactly what the proportion of their wingspan to body weight is, and how much force they expend when they flap a wing, right? We could also learn about the size of bat brains and the arrangement of their neurons, right? Now, excuse me, another interesting thing we can know about bats, and this is especially important, is the mechanisms that help them to navigate at night. So you might know that for bats, they get by in the world largely through echolocation. So a bat can't hear very much, right? A bat can hear a whole lot, right? They can't see very much. So the experience of a bat is pretty interesting because it doesn't see much, but it chirps, right? And those sound waves, bounce up against an object and then they bounce back. And the way and the speed at which they bounce back gives the bat enough information so that they can navigate around and through and between all the objects that they don't want to run into. Right? So this is a really interesting fact about bats. And you could go study bat biology and learn as many physical, empirically observable facts about bats as you can. But Nagel says that there would still be something that we would not know and could not know. What it's like to be a bat. So to fill that in a bit more, we might say, if we know all the facts about physical states, we would not know all there is to know about the bat's mental state, right? So we can understand from a third-person point of view what's going on with bats and how they can perform these remarkable feats of navigation without the use of their eyes. But that would never tell us what it's like to be a bat. Knowledge of all the physical facts won't tell us what it's like to be a bat. So therefore, it cannot be the case that physical states and mental states are identical. Because if what it's like to be a bat were just a physical fact, then that would be something we'd know when we knew all the physical facts. So here's how Nagel puts it on page 221 in our text. He says, after all, what would be left of what it's like to be a bat if one removed the viewpoint of the bat? So a viewpoint of a bat is something separate from and not at all reducible to physical facts about the anatomy of the bat's ears or the arrangement of its neurons or how they fire or what chemicals there are when that bat is having experience. So if that's right, if the viewpoint of the bat is something that you can't know about through careful, exhaustive, empirical observation of bats, then the experience of a bat is not a physical thing, according to Nagel. So remember, this is a knowledge argument, right? So it says, if identity theory were true, there's certain kinds of knowledge we could acquire, but that knowledge is unattainable, so identity theory is false. Well, the knowledge that Nagel says identity theory should get us is what it's like to be a bat. But no amount of physical, empirical, scientific knowledge is going to show us what it's like to be a bat. So it's something separate from a physical, empirical, scientific fact about bats. It's just something separate. So there's Nagel's argument up at the top of the page. So we might wonder, what should the materialist say back to Nagel about this? Well, one thing that they might say is, what if it's actually harder to know about everything in physical things than Nagel is saying? Maybe it's the case that through scientific study, there are some things we can just never know. Right? Remember, we saw something like this when we studied Hume, right? No amount of empirical observation will get you to facts about cause and effect or laws of nature. There are certain things that we just can't get at with science. We can explain them, or at least offer some further support and interconnectedness, but what if we just can't know everything that there is to know about bats, and one of them is the nature of their own experience, which does happen to be a physical fact, according to the materialist. So some materialists can just deny premise 1, right? Some materialists might attack premise 2, right? So Nagel is saying, imagine you knew everything that there was to know physically, empirically about bats. But then he says, but there would still be something we wouldn't know, what it's like to be a bat, what it feels like. Well, couldn't we just say that what if, once you know all the physical facts, you would also know all of the experiential facts? So if I were to give a perfect scan of your brain and knew how to read it in the right way, just like my DVD player knows how to read my DVDs in the right way, wouldn't we be able to know what it's like to be that bat? We could run a software program and sort of get into that bat's head on a merely physical basis. So that's another thought. Here's a last criticism. So, what if you admitted that through scientific study you could know all the physical facts about bats, but even once you know all the physical facts, you still wouldn't know what it feels like to be a bat? Well, this might come back to Smart's suggestion that the logic or the meaning of our physical talk isn't necessarily going to line up with the logic or the meaning of our brain state talk or our thought talk. These brain states and physical stuff on one side and thoughts and mental stuff on the other side. So the thought is, just because you know all the basic physical facts, maybe there are further emergent facts that you won't know. So for instance, you might think that you hear some scientists say this sometimes, that biology is just applied chemistry and chemistry is just applied physics, right? Well, just because you know everything to know about physics and how protons and electrons and quarks behave, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to know everything about how larger composites of these things are going to behave. So you wouldn't necessarily know what happens, say, when you drop pure sodium into pure H2O. What actually does happen, you can watch. You can watch this on YouTube, and it's pretty awesome. You'll see basically that pure sodium is so reactive that it'll basically just explode. It'll light on fire, right? Now, you might say that, look, a physicist can't glean those facts simply by knowing everything that there is to know about particles and protons and electrons. Maybe they might be able to get a grip on it, but maybe we just shouldn't say that just because you know all of the basic physical facts means that you can know even facts about what it's like to be something, the perspective of something, even though what it's like in those perspectives are ultimately physical facts and what they're comprised by. So that'll be something for you to think about. So just to recap, this time around, we looked at the identity theory, the theory that mental states, thoughts, feelings are identical to physical states of the brain, right? But then we looked at Chalmers giving his version of a conceivability argument. We saw Descartes' conceivability argument last time around. This time we saw Chalmers' zombie argument, which says we can imagine a physical duplicate of a conscious being, but completely lacking in consciousness, which suggests that consciousness, in its essence, isn't a physical thing. And then we saw knowledge arguments, which argue that if consciousness were a physical fact, then knowing all the physical facts would tell us everything we need to know about mental states. But empirical knowledge of physical things and all the empirical facts around them doesn't get us knowledge about mental states. So mental states aren't physical. So it's going to be up to you to figure out whether this conceivability argument and whether this knowledge argument are good ones. Whether there's enough to them, whether they've pointed out something about consciousness and thought that makes it somehow special and different from other material processes in the universe. Or you might think, actually, no, I'm still persuaded by this idea that thought is just a thing that happens in the brain. It's completely comprised by certain states in the brain. And the power of identity theory, in explaining how the mind and the body interact, is powerful enough for us to think that maybe there must be something wrong with the conceivability argument or the knowledge argument. And again, if you like the conceivability or the knowledge argument, you're going to have to figure out what to say about these objections that materialists might raise. So this is tricky stuff. I'll give you all the opportunity to voice your views about this in the discussion board. But, philosophy ain't easy. And you're going to have to figure it out for yourself in the end, which of these arguments wins the day according to your judgment. So keep thinking about that. Keep up the hard work. And you'll have a quiz about these questions due on Moodle at the end of the evening on Friday night. So thanks for listening in, and I'll look forward to hearing what all of you have to say about the identity theory. Till next time.